Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We are excited to have you here today, and we're going to be discussing eliminating barriers through culturally responsive teaching with Megan Pollock from the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity. A couple housekeeping items as we get started. I want to let you know that as attendees, all of you are in listen-only mode. If you do have questions as we progress through the webinar, please feel free to put those into the question pane or into the chat box, and we will be able to address those questions. We'll be pausing for questions as we move through the webinar. In addition, there are handouts to today's webinar, and you can go to the handout section right there in your gray nav bar. It says handouts. There are 3 handouts available, so be sure you download those PDFs. And in addition, we'll be sending those out with a follow-up email following the webinar. Just a little note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available tomorrow, Monday, because it's Friday. We'll share that out to the attendees on Monday. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Megan. Welcome, Megan, and get us underway. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited that you've chosen to be here with us on your Friday afternoon. So what we're going to be talking about today is how we can, as educators, in whatever role and capacity that you serve, really begin to eliminate some of the barriers that our students face through culturally responsive teaching. So our overarching sort of big goal, and not necessarily what we're going to accomplish today, but the goal of why we're talking about this is to so that we can start to develop asset and equity-based mindsets that equip us to really meet the needs of every single student that we serve. And ultimately, to really begin to implement curriculum, whether that is in the classroom or whether that's from the school system or whether that's from whatever you do as a counselor or advisor, that really utilizes our students' cultural perspectives from their home and their community. Now, what we're going to try to do today in the 90 minutes that we have together is we'll do a little bit of warm up first, but we'll start to classify the characteristics of a culturally responsive educator. And then we're going to really think about and investigate our own experiences with culturally responsive pedagogy. Then we're going to compare and contrast asset and deficit thinking. I'm also going to add in here some information on understanding the contrasting values framework, so a little bit of the collectivist versus individualist ways of knowing and doing. And then we're going to look at the 5 stages of multicultural curriculum transformation. And then finally, our goal is that you leave here with at least the beginning of a plan, a strategy for how you can increase personal and pedagogical cultural responsiveness. Now, when we initially planned to do this curriculum, it was the intent that everyone would have a copy of the Eliminating Barriers Through Culturally Responsive Teaching with them. Clearly, our world has changed so much in the last few weeks, and so you probably don't have this with you. I really hope that you'll get the book after life sort of resumes some kind of normalcy, or we find some balance in all of the time that we're facing, because you'll want to dive into this. This is really a full day workshop. We're going to just touch on some of the highlights of some of the content today. And so as we go through this, and this is, I think, recorded, so I think that Amy has that set up. If that's the case, then you'll be able to come back and watch this again and see some of the page numbers if you want, as they're aligned to that. Now, I did, as Amy pointed out, put some handouts that are available to you. You can download them all now and then access them when we come to those parts of the webinar, or just download them one at a time when we're ready to look at those different kinds of things. So those handouts are really just sort of snapshots out of the larger book, but that's definitely not complete. So the book here is, you know, in much greater detail than what we're going to be able to go through, and so I do hope that you'll get that. Amy has already gone through the details on the platform. This is a webinar where I need you to participate. So our goal is that we learn from these kinds of opportunities. So if you find that you have like 100 screens open and you're trying to do 10 things, I invite you to peel that back and try to focus in with us during our time together, because I'm going to be doing a little bit of teaching, and then we're going to have some chat and conversation in the chat box. And so And I think that there might be a possibility. I don't know where you can raise your hand if you have questions, but for sure you can add those specific questions in the chat box, in the question box. So on your screen, there should be two ways to input information. One's the chat. That's the sort of general way that we're going to communicate with each other. And then question box, where you can put your specific questions, and then Amy, Dr. Julian, will help me sort of filter those out and then come back to those. So before we dive in, my name is Megan Pollock. I live in Dallas, Texas, and I have been working in this kind of space doing educational equity training for just over 10 years. And I came to this work because I'm an engineer. I worked as an engineer, and I worked in industry for Texas Instruments, and really decided that I wanted to figure out, how do we increase the participation of women and people of color in engineering and other high-tech fields, and shifted my career to focusing on that. And so for the last decade, I've done teacher professional development and writing and curriculum development, really at the heart of understanding, how do we better serve each and every student. And so while my history and focus has been specifically on increasing the participation of women and people of color in STEM fields, at the end of the day, what we're talking about it's just good teaching, right? It's just good teaching that really begins to serve each and every student that we come into contact with. So to get us warmed up, and I'm really, really looking for your participation here, and I'll try to have some sort of similarity. I've tried to put some similarity in the slides so that you'll know when I'm looking for your feedback in the chat box. So to get us started, why do you think we need culturally responsive teaching? Now, I've got three boxes there in different colors that sort of frame why we think we need this this skill set. But tell me, add into the chat box, why do you think we need culturally responsive teaching? What are your ideas? What brought you to this webinar?
We've got some great responses coming in. One individual says, be all three. Another individual said, because students need a safe place in order to learn. Another individual said, students need to see themselves in the curriculum.
So Amy, is there a way to be able to see these chats as well?
Yeah, let me click a button here and you'll be able to see those as well. Again, you can post in the chat box or in the question pane. You're welcome to post in both. And then, Megan, you should have that capability now. And then in addition to that, if you do want to raise your hand and your speaker and microphones are working, when we do ask for questions, feel free to raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. As Megan said, she's in Texas. I'm in Central Illinois. Kyler's up in Elgin, so we're all over today. No one's sitting next to each other in the same space, but definitely in the same virtual space. So I'll let you read those, Megan, and I'll.
Okay, great. I think I won't be able to see anything before you open the screen for me, but that's okay. And so I can go ahead and jump forward here. So as you've noted, some of you have noted, like, this is really critical. You know, it's not just because well, first of all, it's the right thing to do, right? As educators, when we signed up for this life, we decided that we wanted to serve every student. And it's our job, our responsibility to figure out, how do we do that? And so this is a really big piece of that. And so, you know, certainly when we begin to teach in a culturally responsive way, we see that our students do have increased achievement. We do begin to close the opportunity gap. And ultimately, we are able to begin to yield success with a diverse workforce. So thank you for chatting. I've got another question before we dive in. Now, this is another warm-up. Now, before we start learning about culturally responsive teaching and the specific steps that we can take to increase our cultural responsiveness, I want us to take a minute to reflect on our own practice. And so I've got three boxes here and ways that I want you to think about this. So we want to look at and reflect on our work from an environmental context, thinking about what are the texts, the posters, the videos, other materials that students encounter in your environment. the question I want you to think about is, do those materials represent the diverse backgrounds of your students? And then in what ways and how often do you present culturally diverse material? That's an environmental context. The next piece is how you acquire curriculum. So I want you to think about, how do you gather materials and lessons to use in your practice in whatever way that looks like for your role? And then I want you to think about, what do you consider when you're deciding what to teach? What's the lens that you use when you're selecting that content? And the third perspective I want you to think about is the pedagogical practice. I want you to think about the instructional strategies that you employ. What's the most common thing? Are you mostly employing, competition style things? Are you mostly employing sort of lecture, single direction kind of things? Certainly, I know our entire life as educators has been disrupted right now, so I totally understand that. But I want you to think about, what's your normal thing here? And then finally, what do you consider when you're deciding how to teach? So share some of those reflections in your chat box for me. And I know that you're all actively adding things. And if that's true, Amy, I still can't see anything.
It's under questions, so you need to pull the question pane, and then you'll be able to see all of those. Yeah.
Oh,
so yeah, we have people saying things like,
okay,
they've often tried to be diverse in their curriculum.
Okay.
They can add in the chat for the question.
Okay. So if for just the responses like this, it would be really helpful if you put your responses in the chat box, and then make sure that you select to the entire audience so that everyone can see. And then let's just use the question box specifically for what we're trying to do. Now, Amy, we do have a question about, where is closed captioning? Is this a option that we can turn on for?
It is not. So a couple questions coming in. The chat box is underneath the handout. So if you scroll down underneath handouts, there is where the chat box is located, and that's in your gray navigation. And then closed captioning is sometimes on the platform when you set it up on your end, but that is not something that the organizer has the ability to sign up. AI has some issues with closed captioning, so GoToWebinar has not adapted that, but we will be sharing the transcript of the webinar, and if you do phone in and use the phone in option, any of your JAWS or other hearing impairment adaptabilities will work with the phone in option.
Okay, so to those of you who are not able to hear what I'm saying because of this inaccessible platform, I'm really sorry, and we'll do everything that we can to make sure that you have the resources that you need after this to review the transcript. So I do offer my sincerest apologies for that. Okay, so I'm just scrolling through some of the contents here. Okay, great. Now that you've reflected a little bit about your own experience, I want us to begin to put some meat around this, but I want to set a background for kind of where we come into this work. Now, hopefully some of you were with me when we met just a few months ago back in Illinois, and so if you were there with me, then this will sound a little bit familiar. But I want to introduce you to NAEP's theoretical framework and what grounds all of our work. And so and this is from an interpersonal lens. It certainly doesn't look necessarily at equity from a sort of systemic lens. So this is really about the interpersonal and the relational part of what we experience as educators. So with the students at our center, we have to recognize that there are so many cultural stereotypes about each and every one of us, about our students, about us, about the schools that we operate and function in. And these stereotypes, whatever they may be, these stereotypes can become sort of single stories that we all hold. And these single stories, they create stereotypes. So a single story would be something that's sort of told over and over again and that really becomes a sort of singular narrative. And so if you were with us a few months ago, we watched the TED Talk, The Danger of the Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie. And if you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to watch it. And so the key quote from that TED Talk is she says that the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so these stereotypes that we hold, these stereotypes become part of our brain. They become part of how our brain is kind of wired. And there are neural networks in our brain that both hold cultural stereotypes, that hold implicit biases, that hold the different prejudices that each and every one of us have. And these single stories that we hold, so I have sort of pictures of like the sort of archetype of the engineer based on this sort of Dilbert character, this very geeky kind of narrative. And this has become a single story that's told over and over again. It's perpetuated in like the uniform of the Geek Squad from Best Buy. It's perpetuated in the cast of The Big Bang Theory. And these single stories become schemas. These are these patterns of thought or behavior that that organizes categories of information and relationships among them within our brain. And these schemas, they begin to manifest in different kinds of ways. And so the way that these things manifest are through what we call micro-messages. Micro-messages are small, subtle, unconscious messages that we both send and receive when we interact with others. There are two types of micro-messages. One is micro-affirmations and the other is micro-inequities. So micro-affirmations, these build our students up. They make our students feel valued, included, encouraged. They are intentional and they're always positive. Whereas micro-inequities, these make students feel excluded, devalued. They're always negative. They make our students feel discouraged. And in this case, they're always unintentional. So if you're sending intentional micro-inequity, if you're sending intentional messages that exclude, devalue, and discourage students, we call it something totally else, something totally different, right? But the way that these messages manifest in our communications are through the words that we say, the simple verbal words that come out of our mouth. You know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, right? But the actual words can hurt, especially in that accumulative kind of way. Paraverbal is how it's said. Nonverbal is our body language. Contextual and omission, that's what's said or what's not said. It's what's there or not there. And then praise and criticism, this is how we give feedback. And so there are lots of ways that these micro messages can happen. We're going to talk a little bit today about also the collectivist and individualistic kinds of values. This is particularly interesting in how it's manifested in our culture just over the last few weeks in dealing with COVID-19. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this, but these kinds of competing values that we'll learn a little bit about later, even these become micro messages that send signals of whether students belong or don't belong, or whether their ways of knowing and doing are valued. And that becomes part of a culturally responsive educator. The next part of the culture wheel, or our theoretical framework, is recognizing that when we've got these stereotypes, they become biases that each and every one of us hold. They manifest in a variety of different ways, but it's the accumulation of these messages that is so critical and influential to our students. And so you can sort of think about it as a sort of scale. Our students are getting positive messages and negative messages over time, and it's that sort of balance of messages that affects their self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is the belief a student has in their ability to accomplish a task. It answers that question, can I do this? And so that self-efficacy manifests in a variety of different ways. And we're going to talk about this in a webinar on April 13th. So we're going to dive really deep into understanding self-efficacy and how we can adjust our instructional strategies and our feedback to better serve those students. And so drawing this back in, so we've got the stereotypes, the bias, the micro messages, and they manifest and accumulate in different ways. It affects student self-efficacy. And that, again, that self-efficacy drives behavior, right? It's the root of motivation. And so when we look at where do we interrupt this cycle, we interrupt this cycle as educators by really beginning to understand what are the stereotypes and the bias that are part of my experience and part of my brain, and how are they affecting how I interact with others? And that's where we begin to interrupt the cycle. Secondarily, what we really want to begin thinking about too is what are our stereotypes and biases and prejudices embedded in our systems, and they're sending not only micro messages but putting up true barriers to student success, and how can we begin to disrupt those as well. Now, the sort of the big question of many is, what is culturally responsive teaching? And I like to share two different quotes here. So one is from Geneva Gay. She's considered the sort of the sort of godmother of this theory, and she writes that using the cultural perspective characteristics, experiences, and perspectives of ethnically diverse students as conduits for teaching them more effectively, right? So we're using students, their experiences, as ways to teach them in more effective and efficient kinds of ways. I love this other quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, and he says that the Western arrogance, a feeling that has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them, is not just. And so what this quote means to me is it really puts into perspective this notion of, like, I'm going to teach the way I always teach because that's just the way it's done. And I think that there's sort of an interesting way that this is manifesting even in how we're all trying to shift to this online learning platform, is that we have to really begin to understand, how do we serve our students? Like, we cannot just do the things the way that they've always done, because that system, that way of knowing and doing, wasn't created to serve every student. And we have to be willing to open up and learn from others and use that as a way to teach and better serve the students that are in our world. So at this point, you can download the first attachment, and we're going to be covering some of the key components of a culturally responsive educator. And so make sure that you've got that in front of you, because I'm going to kind of skim over the sort of the key things here that we want to think about. What does it mean to be a culturally responsive educator? And then from there, we're going to be looking in a little bit deeper at some of the different concepts. And so again, this is in the download attachment 1, and then you can skip a few pages down to see what these key components are. So first of all, the first key component of a culturally responsive educator is someone who has a deep and diverse cultural knowledge. So this means that the individual is really working to understand, examine the cultural characteristics and learning styles of others. Now, I want to put a caveat. This isn't learning styles of, like, and sort of old traditional way of thinking of, like, learning styles of, like, oh, I'm a tactile, visual. That's not the kind of learning styles. It's looking at how does learning differ for people from different cultures, and we'll look a little bit about that at how we talk about the sort of collectivist versus individualistic views a little bit later today. And so again, this is something that really becomes a journey for us as educators, that there's always more room for us to begin to learn about other cultures. A really big part of this that sort of comes down, and one of the other things, is firstly understanding our own culture. So the second key component of a culturally responsive educator is the way in which we implement culturally responsive curriculum and instructional strategies. And so this means that we're actively working to evaluate and amend our curriculum so that we have diverse models and authors, and that the cultural representations are not just sort of tacked in, and they're not oversimplified or inaccurate. And so this isn't just looking at our textbooks. Like, that's certainly something we need to do, but it's also, really examining sort of the symbolic pieces of our curriculum, like the artifacts that are part of our school and our environments. The second piece of this is the way in which we encourage students to analyze socio-political context. And so this means that, we're diving in and understanding and teaching students to really begin to think critically and thoughtfully about what's happening in the socio-political schema. And so we want our students to begin to think about and contextualize experiences, the histories, and other issues through different lenses. I recently was in DC, not recently, well, a couple months ago, I was in DC and got to go to the Native American Museum. And one of the things I loved about it is within every single display, there were two completely different perspectives. The perspectives of the Native Americans and from the sort of traditional, US, non-Native perspective. And I liked that because it really helped me understand the sort of history that was experienced in this. And so we have to be really thoughtful and careful about the way in which we teach to understand which story has been told and how are we really examining what's happening from multiple lenses and perspectives. The third part of this piece is the way in which we directly confront controversial topics. And this can be a little intimidating for different individuals, but for us to be a culturally responsive educator, we have to be willing to have these conversations where we're talking about political topics such as race directly, and we're really helping students to develop that critical consciousness around different topics. It doesn't mean that you need to have a PhD in racial equity to have these conversations. That's not what it means. It means that we need to be able to talk about these things and not shy away from them. The third key component of a culturally responsive educator is an educator that builds a culturally caring learning environment. And so the first one seems pretty obvious, right? Like we should have high expectations for our students and be dedicated to their success. But one of the things that we know that happens is that the way that bias and prejudice and stereotypes function in our brains, that can affect the way in which we engage with students. It can lower our expectations unconsciously in many ways and manifest in ways that doesn't support student success. And so to be a culturally responsive educator, we need to have an increasing, growing awareness of the way in which stereotypes and prejudice and bias functions in our own brain and how it could be affecting how we engage with students so that we can make sure that we do have those highest expectations for students for outside of those parts of our brain and history. The second piece of this is for us to use a student-centered approach. And so we have some other curriculum around problem and project-based learning that really dives into how to be a student-centered educator. But it's looking at when how you're designing curriculum and how you're facilitating curriculum and the pedagogy that you use is what you're doing focused on the students' the students' contribution to that, or is it more of like, so this is sort of the anecdote of like, not the anecdote, the phrase of like, are you the sage on the stage or are you the guide on the side? If you're acting more as a guide on the side, then that's really lending itself more towards that student-centered approach. And that really connects well with a lot of the self-efficacy that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks because of the way that really supports student motivation and it supports student autonomy and choice as well. The next piece of this is that you understand and appreciate your own and others' cultures. I can, share that personally growing up, so I am a white woman, and growing up, I was raised in a community that people that looked just like me for the most part, and I didn't really understand my own culture, right? I had been raised to believe that culture is what belonged to other individuals who look different than me. And so, and that's very true of many white people in this country and how they've been raised to not understand that we all have a culture, right? And you must learn to understand and appreciate your culture, and then also understanding the culture of others and appreciating that as well. And so this is really part of that, introspective journey that we have to take in our own work to really understand and value what is the culture that you have? What's the culture in which you were raised with, and how does that shape who you are? And then really begin to understand how that affects others as well. The next key component of a culturally responsive educator is that we communicate effectively with culturally diverse students. And so what this means, first of all, is that we've got to have cultural competence. We've got to be able to have those sort of crucial, intentional conversations that allow us to connect and engage with our students. And the second part of this is that we have to be able to accurately interpret students' thinking, and that we teach code switching. And so code switching is this way in which people will sort of switch ways of knowing and doing as a sort of survival tactic in a different space. So you might notice that some students change how they speak based on who they're around. That's code switching. Some of us may change the ways in which we act in different spaces, and that's code switching. And so it's important for a culturally responsive educator to understand that code switching is happening, to understand that code switching is not only happening, but it's taking up a good, a portion of our bandwidth, and that can affect how we interact and engage in a learning kind of space. But also recognize that when a student is code switching, or a person is code switching, in many cases, they're having to code switch to match the sort of dominant culture and way of knowing and doing. And so that in and of itself is saying, dear student, dear person, who you are isn't sort of welcome and valued in this space. We need you to behave in these kinds of ways. That's an implicit sort of belief and way in which students sort of function and work. But as a culturally responsive educator, we need to have an understanding of what is code switching, how is it happening, and how do we honor our students and really help them to feel like they can be their true authentic self, and ways in which that can happen in a learning environment. The next key piece here is that a culturally responsive educator, again, is really looking at instructional strategies of how to serve diverse students, and that we're integrating cultural diversity into the core curriculum frequently. And so we'll talk a little bit about this when we look at the stages of multicultural competency, to really look at, are we just having a Women's History Month, a Black History Month? Like, that's not integrated curriculum, right? Like, that's isolated kinds of events for our school and our curriculum. And then the final piece here is that a culturally responsive educator is transforming and empowering school culture. And so this means that the educator is not only that they're reflecting on increasing the institution that they work on, their cultural responsivity. So this is a point where you're moving away from your own identity and how you engage with students, and really looking to influence the school and the structure and the systems in which you work. So let's look at an example of what cultural responsive teaching looks like in action. And so I'm going to read this screen, and this is an example from our book. So after conducting a student interest survey at the beginning of the year, 7th grade humanities teacher Ms. Jackson learns of the various languages, cultures, and ethnicities within her classroom. She purposefully plans her curriculum to represent all of these rich differences. She seeks out Chicano and African American poetry related to core subjects, makes sure posters on the wall representing famous historical figures include various races and genders, and supplements the social studies text with her primary source material from various perspectives. Ms. Jackson has students research their own cultures and create an art project representing some aspect of that culture. She then showcases these prominently throughout the classroom. Ms. Jackson has a group of students in her classroom who speak English as a second language. These students are considered English language learners. Instead of enforcing an English-only policy within her classroom, she utilizes students' home languages and cultures within her classroom. Ms. Jackson asks her ELL students to become the experts and teach their classmates some words from their home languages, including slang terms. Ms. Jackson has transformed her traditional classroom into a cultural exchange of knowledge where the students become the experts and the teacher becomes the facilitator. So with that example in mind, I want to lead us to another way for us to engage. So please use the chat box here so that everyone can see and follow along and we can respond to each other. And so again, not the question box, use the chat box, please. Share with me, what
Megan,
is your vision? Oh yeah.
I'm sorry, Megan, just to clarify, depending on if they're using the app or if they're on their computer, the chat is the question is the chat. So they can see everything that we can see in a lot of cases. So we're just going to use whatever works for you in your platform, in your home that you're using. I've responded to everybody and said just use the question chat or the chat question, whatever works. But we are hearing you on our end.
Okay. Got it. Let me spread out this question thing so I can better see what people are saying. Okay, cool. All right, so my questions to you are, what is your vision of a culturally responsive classroom? How do you currently integrate your students' cultures into your curriculum? And then finally, what are some obstacles to being a culturally responsive educator? So I'll look for your responses in the chat box. Okay, so I'm looking for some responses. So we've got something here. So I think that's important to continually learn about different cultures other than our own while not relying on the students who are marginalized. Yeah, I think so, Michelle, for sure. One of the things that I recommend here is that we must constantly be learning, right? I've worked with people who say, well, I don't have any, people of color in my life. How am I going to learn this? And so first of all, Michelle, I appreciate your point here is that it's not the responsibility of the Black and brown people in our life to teach us about their cultures. It is not their responsibility. If they want to share that with us, that's wonderful, but it is not their responsibility. First of all, there are so many books you can read, so many TED Talks that you can watch, so many movies and documentaries that you can watch to learn about other people's cultures. One simple thing is to just follow people on Twitter and look at their conversation and look at their stories and look at their narratives. This is really a responsibility for us to explore and us to research. How are you learning and what are the museums that you're going to? You can read books by people, even fiction books by people who are telling stories and narratives from their lived experiences and cultures. And so definitely we want to make sure that we're exploring lots of different ways. So giving students opportunities to share something about their countries, yes, for sure. I think that's a great way. One of the easiest ways to start that conversation is around food. How do we all partake and share and enjoy in food? So we have another example of discussing their history. I take into account the Latino and African American experience in the U.S. So we have an example as a college psychology instructor that the content itself is limited in terms of historical figures. That's certainly an obstacle. Yeah. So there are absolute obstacles when the curriculum is provided for you. I like to pick on my little brother. My little brother is, he's not little, he's 6'3" and a grown man now, but he teaches high school history. And in his first year as a history teacher, he called me and was like, Megan, you're gonna be so proud of me. I have planned an entire day about women in history. And I picked on a little bit of like, well, one day is certainly not enough, right? But like, it certainly was his effort. I think he's up to a couple days now, but he has made a really intentional effort to bring the stories of other people who are not represented in his curriculum into the classroom. And so he has to do that work. And another one of his colleagues is really working into bringing different stories and narratives and really pushing boundaries in their school to start to tell some of these stories. And so it is a challenge when the curriculum is provided for you. But one of the things that we want to do as educators is to figure out how do we begin to supplement and ultimately influence that curriculum for everyone. Deborah, I got a question that was the scenario printed in the material somewhere. It is in the book on page 7, but it's not in the materials I sent to you, I don't think. Okay, so now what I want to encourage you to do is to download the second attachment. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at I'm going to teach 2 different kinds of frameworks, and then we're going to do an activity to apply that. So the first thing that we're going to look at are contrasting values. Now, the contrasting values is not in this book, but it's really timely to what I think that we're experiencing right now. So I want to make sure that we talk about. The asset deficit is the third attachment, and then we'll do the application. So the first thing is I want us to dive into the individualistic versus the collectivist values. Now, this particular information that I'm presenting to you, this comes directly from some of the Native American literature, and so it helps us to really understand the differences between ways of knowing and doing. And again, when we're talking about sort of ways of knowing and doing, I want you to think about like your mode of operation. It's that instant sort of preference, it's that instant sort of type of reaction. And there's no right or wrong to either of these value sets that we're going to look at. It's just an example of how different cultures raise up different humans and the sort of most highly valued things in those different communities. Now, Hassid and his group has done a tremendous amount of research to look at the sort of ratings of different countries of individualistic versus collectivist values. And in the US has a very dominant individualistic cultural value, whereas many Hispanic and Asian countries tend to have, and Native communities have a much more collectivist value. So we're going to look at some of those differences. Again, I encourage you to look at the second handout for the breakdown of these. So for the individualistic cultural values, this is so interesting how this is manifested even in these sort of stay-at-home social physical isolation thing that we're experiencing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the sort of first notion of individualist cultural values is a sort of symbol of independence. It's this notion of constant freedom, of self-sufficiency, and control over our life. And an example of how that might look in someone's thinking is like, I tend to do my own thing and others in my family do the same. The second key part of this is around goals, and it's sort of an intent to always be striving towards our own goals, our own achievements. And this, and from a mindset view, looks like the taking great pride in accomplishing what no one else can. Another key tenet of an individualistic culture is around competition. This notion that we must always compete, we must always win, we must always do better than others. And the next one is around this notion of wanting to be unique and how we can always sort of separate and identify our differences from others. And the next key pieces are around privacy, wanting to really value the privacy that you have in keeping thoughts and actions private from others. The next piece is around self-knowledge and the way that you choose to know yourself and having that really strong personal identity. An example of what this might look like in sort of a thought process is I know my weaknesses and my strengths. And another key piece of an individualistic cultural value set is a direct communication style, that you say what you want when you want it and just being really direct. And so I have to admit, like, this is how I was raised. I was raised in a very individualistic cultural value, which is interesting because it actually flies in the face of so many things that industry actually values from a team perspective. We'll look at the sort of collectivist values next. Um, but for me, I have to be really aware of like my MO, my immediate response, my go-to reaction for everything is almost always going to align with this. And the reason is that when you're raised and as you're being raised, whether you're being raised by you know, two parents at home, one parent, grandma, the media, the TV, whatever it is that's raised us all up to be the individuals that we are, the sort of subtle feedback that we get from the world, it sort of shapes us, right? And it essentially begins to sort of wire how our brain functions and chooses to act and react in different spaces. And so let's look at the collectivist values, and then we'll put some sort of context to what we're noticing in schools and around the pandemic response. So collectivist cultural values is the first domain is this notion of relation with others, that you consider yourself to be an integral, that you're part of a larger set of others. And this really ties closely to sort of belonging and looking at you're part of a group that's better for me to act on behalf of the whole than to what's just going to benefit me. And don't confuse this sort of belonging statement to me, pleasure spending time with others. This isn't a function of like, are you an introvert or an extrovert? That's not what this is, right? But again, it's this notion of a value set. The third one here is around duty. The duties and sacrifices of being part of a group member are prominent over everything else. Everything I do matters most for how I'm serving the whole. Harmony is this notion of making sure in all cases that the harmony in the group and that the group is getting along. There's a strong tendency to seek advice from collectivist culture, so always turning, most often turning to close others for decision help. And here, context is in a way that yourself changes, sort of adapts and morphs according to the context or situation. And there's also a greater sense of hierarchy and status. You know, sort of a sort of a notion of elders and sort of familial structures here. So these are some kinds of differences between collectivist and individualistic cultural values that we can look at. And I didn't list all of the domains. In fact, I think that your handout, let me see if I can pull it up. I think your handout actually has perhaps a different set. No, they look about the same. Yeah, they're very close to what I just went over for you. And so I want you to hold on to these collectivist values because we're going to apply it in just a second. But one of the things that I've been seeing in the news is this notion of like many Americans tend to have a very individualistic cultural value set. But what we need right now, as evidenced in so much of the news, is we need to have a very collectivist cultural value to survive the pandemic that we're facing. And there's a real tension between those two things. And it's interesting to sort of watch and see how people are reacting of like, well, I'm going to do my own thing. It doesn't matter. But then really sometimes pulling back to trying to hold those collectivist values. Now, how this looks in our classroom is that if you are perhaps like me and raised to kind of have this kind of value set, your way of knowing and doing is going to most likely be deeply representative in how you teach. How you grade is going to be aligned to your value set. How you set up your pedagogical instruction is going to be aligned to this. And so what we want to begin to do is to think about what are the values and the ways of knowing and doing that you're offering in your classroom, and how are you serving your students? Because it's not right or wrong. It's just recognizing that there are different ways of knowing and doing. And if the only way that I teach is aligned to the individualistic cultural values, I'm sending a subtle signal to everyone who has a collectivist values that their ways of knowing and doing aren't welcome, valued, or related to anything that we're trying to cover. So now we're going to look at the attachment 3. We're going to look a little bit about asset and deficit perspectives, and then we're going to do an exercise. So an asset and deficit perspective is the sort of difference of when the student's home culture is dissimilar from the teacher or the school's culture. So an asset perspective is an example in which we think and believe, so this is also aligned with a sort of value belief system in which the student has a rich cultural knowledge. We acknowledge that they have this rich cultural knowledge, and then we acknowledge that their students' cultural knowledge is a resource. It's a value add to the classroom. It's an acknowledgement that the cultural knowledge can be strategically used as a bridge between home and school. And then finally, it's when the educator really helps students make those connections between home and school, and home meaning their own lived experience and culture. Now, a deficit perspective is this sort of inherent belief that student has a lack of knowledge. This might sound something like, oh, that student just cannot speak English. Oh, that student, this, that. These kinds of statements, sort of exasperations, but also implicit biases in how we react. It sees students' cultural knowledge as a hindrance to the classroom, a hindrance to learning. The cultural knowledge is not used as a bridge between home and school. And that finally, this affects our expectations. This comes back to one of those first bullet points that we talked about. It affects our expectations of students, and really relinquishes our responsibility for their student success. It looks at the student as what they're bringing to the classroom as a deficit and says, this is not my problem. They don't do this, they don't do that. And that is coming from a deficit perspective. So again, you've got these 2 worksheets of tables. I want you to look at them. We're going to merge contrasting values, and we're going to merge asset deficit thinking for an application here. Now, I've got a few scenarios, and the scenarios are based on some characters. And so I'm going to introduce the student character to you, and then each of the scenarios is going to have a slide like this. The big blue box is going to be a teacher's comment with a deficit perspective. And then the scenario how this is going to work out is, imagine that another teacher says that. And then you're going to insert yourself into the classroom and just watch, and you're going to observe what you think is actually happening in that class. And then the third piece of this is the asset perspective response. So this is what we're going to practice. We're going to practice, if you hear a teacher, educator, a person, anyone who holds a deficit perspective, you're going to have your sort of observation, and I'm going to give you what that observation is, and then you're going to provide this asset perspective response. Okay, so we'll do the first one, and it'll make a little bit more sense. So the first character I want to introduce you to is Jorge. Jorge is a Hispanic young man in high school. And then this is something that a teacher says about him. A teacher says, Jorge is constantly disengaging during our competition challenges. Boys usually love to compete. He starts off strong, but then his participation fades as things heat up. I don't think he's learning the content because of this, which places him further and further behind. What can I do? So you hear a teacher say this, and then you pop in and observe, and you notice that Jorge is usually grouped with some very extroverted boys who act cliquish. It seems like he doesn't relate. So again, you've got what teachers are saying, the teacher's saying here, you observe this. Now, when we acknowledge that many Hispanic cultures are collectivist cultures, so you've got that to look at, how could you respond in an asset-based way? Now, I'll give you the first example here. So the response could be, not all students like or thrive off of competition. That's off of the cultural values page. So everything doesn't need to be competition. And by the way, this is so true. If everything that we offer is a competition, it's not honoring the ways of knowing and doing of students who don't have competition as their sort of main mode of operation. Then you could also say, thoughtfully creating groups where students are able to relate and feel like they belong would be another strategy to help him be successful. So again, what we're looking at here is we're seeing a deficit perspective view, and then we're offering an asset perspective response. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so let's look at the next example. Dakota is a Native American elementary student. And this specific scenario is drawn from a book called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. It's modified, but it's inspired by that. So it is a true story. So here you hear a teacher in the hallway say, Dakota is always talking. I tell her to stop and she persists. She even talks during quizzes and exams. I'm already docking her points. I just don't know what to do with her anymore. So you pop in the classroom and have a look, and you notice that Dakota isn't just talking, she's helping other students. So add into the chat box how you could respond to this teacher using an asset perspective. So again, how do we look at what that student brings to the classroom as value? And you can use the cultural values framework to see what's not lining up with perhaps this teacher's view. So I'll look at the chat box to see what you think. So Elizabeth says, make her peer tutor before exams. Yeah, that's a great idea. Adam says, suggest that she appoint Dakota as a student helper. Excellent, yes. Nicole says, this student is an asset to the classroom and she should be given a tutoring or buddy role. Yes, yes. Michelle says, in regards to the quizzes, could she listen to music when taking them? I don't know. Sure. I mean, if that would benefit the student, for sure. Gretchen adds mentor. Yeah. So you all have it. And so the suggested response here to this is to first thank Dakota. Right? She's being really generous, helping others. And allow her to help others when she feels the desire to do so. However, make an agreement with her that you'll be clear during the times that no helping is allowed. Because you want to, she's sharing, that's a collectivist cultural value, and she's helping and serving. And so those are great assets to the classroom. But for sure, like there are times like during tests where we don't want to share. And so how you would manage this and make the student still feel like a whole individual is helping to coach her and say, look, Dakota, I'm so grateful that you do this. However, there really are times when we can't share, and then you're going to have some kind of way of communicating with her when you can't help others. All right. So the next example is Marisol. So Marisol, again, true story. Marisol was a colleague of mine during my graduate program. And here's something that that many people would say. Marisol is so quiet. Her classmates get frustrated because she doesn't participate in group. I see that she's physically engaged and completes her task. She just doesn't talk to them. As a result, she consistently loses participation points, but that doesn't change her behavior. Funny thing is, she writes the most beautiful papers and essays. How can I get her to talk more in class? So you pop in to observe, and you notice that Marisol is an English learner and a very hard worker. While she seems shy, she seems to enjoy the group work. You see her on task, reading and writing throughout the class. Now, I'm going to look back over to the chat box and tell me, how can we spin what this teacher is seeing? How do we see what Marisol's experience is as an asset to the class? So Bonnie says, have her share essays. Nicole says you can use written entrance and exit tickets that are collected and the teacher reads them. Elizabeth says, offer various ways to earn participation points. Maybe allow participation points to be assessed through different modes. Yeah, as in small group or written word. Maybe Marisol is from a different culture in which listening, oh, I forgot to tell you, so Marisol's from Colombia. So she is from a collectivist culture. So Michelle says maybe she's from a culture in which listening first is how students learn, how we can use different activities and assignments to highlight her learning style. Yeah. So here's the sort of suggested response, and then I'll tell you sort of the real world what happened. So your response as an educator who's learning to build an asset mindset, you respond and say, try using a group process that rotates speaking opportunities and lets students know when they'll be expected to participate so they can be ready. Also, instead of all participation grades being drawn from in class, create a back channel where every student must participate, like a blog or forum for points. That way, students can have their own space to shine. So what one of my professors did, Dr. Polly, she created this whole back channel blog for all of us to participate in, and it was a 10% of our grade, so it was worth the whole letter grade in the end, for the end of the semester. And the reason is that you had to both post there and comment on what everyone else was writing. And Marisol, who is a Colombian student, she's an English language learner, and she did write the most beautiful pieces. But again, in class, she was just so quiet. And so there could be a variety of ways, reasons why that was. One is like she just may feel more comfortable in that space. Two, she may have felt intimidated because of her language skills. Three, it could have just been the sort of dynamics of the group. But what the equitable part of this is, one, you're not only creating space for students with different ways of knowing and doing to participate, but Dr. Polly, she embedded it as a value in the course by making it a big piece of our grade. And so she's honoring them rather than just saying, oh, it's worth a few points kind of thing. You're really sending a signal of value by creating that other channel. So let's look now at Arun. So Arun is an Indian male student, and the Indian cultures are also collectivist cultures. And now let's look at what you hear a teacher say. Arun drives me nuts. He is constantly asking me for more instructions, clarification, and general advice. I tell him to ask students who sit near him. Honestly, they just ignore him. Why doesn't he just listen when I give instructions and get to work like other students? Now, you pop in the classroom and you observe that Arun is asking people what they think and including others, which seems to make others feel included. He demonstrates a tremendous respect for the teacher and other authority figures and appears to be sure he's always getting it right. Now, how can you look at this, what you sort of learned about Arun, and how we can respond to him? So Elizabeth, you asked the question, what cultures aren't collectivist? So the traditional American culture is not collectivist. Most Western European cultures are individualistic. So pretty much the West are individualistic. And you can look on, I could send a link later, there's a rating, if you look up like Hofstede's rating of cultural values. I don't think that's the best search term, but you can see which countries rate on that. And so US is the highest ranked, I think, individualistic culture, and certainly other Western style cultures fall into that. Okay, so let me look at some of your responses. Betsy says, provide the student with written instructions, offer him some reassurances that he is doing it right, and listen to him so that he feels heard. Betsy also says, ask him to parrot back what he thinks you said. So when we look at what is happening with Arun, we can see from the collectivist cultural values, several things here. One, it's a constantly seeking advice, not constantly, but like regular wanting to seek advice. There's a sort of note of hierarchy here, respect for authority figures. He's wanting to include others, so he's really seeking that sort of collective, collaborative nature, and so that's part of his value system. And so we want to make sure that we're helping him in that. And so we could respond and say, because Arun is great at including others, point out that helping others is a leadership characteristic, and then let him know that it's okay to make mistakes, and that is how learning happens. So those are some of the responses that you could offer to him. So let's go to a sort of reflection of this. When have you had an asset perspective or a deficit perspective? I want you to think about previous experiences and outcomes for each perspective and consider the impacts of those on the students that are part of those experiences. I'd love to hear and to read what some of the things are that you can share. When have you had an asset perspective When have you had a deficit perspective? All right, well, I hope all of you are reflecting on your own. All right. Oh, someone says this requires an essay. Yes. It definitely does require some reflection for sure. So once you get the book, there are lots more exercises to help you reflect on this. So we just can't do them all in the space in such a short time. So I want us to again launch forward a little bit here. So again, grab the book when you can, and do some of the exercises to help us really begin to apply some of these things. So what we're talking about here is the way in which we can improve equity in our classrooms. And so probably many of you have seen a poster similar to this, and how equality is when every student gets the same, and equity is making sure every student has what they need to succeed. I've got a really short little video that describes equity and inclusion. There's equity and equality, and I'm gonna see if it runs. So I'm gonna start playing the video. If you don't hear audio, then let me know and we'll skip forward, okay? Okay, I don't hear any audio.
I do not hear any audio.
You do not hear any audio, okay. Well, I will send this to you all as a link. Thank you for your feedback, everyone. It's a short, 1.5-minute clip, but I'll send it to you afterwards. So when we're thinking about equity in education, it means that personal and social circumstances such as gender, ethnic origin, family background are not obstacles to achieving educational or professional potential. And so we have to keep this in mind as we're moving throughout our journey and becoming a more culturally responsive educator. Now, what does it mean for us to begin teaching or working in a culturally responsive way? There are three different sort of perspectives in which we want to engage and reflection here. One is the self, the second is students, and the third is looking at what's happening in the classroom. So when we begin to teach in a culturally responsive way, it requires a continuous reevaluation of our perspective, how it's influenced by our culture, and how it impacts students. And so again, this is a journey. We're always on this journey and working to learn different ways. There are in the book, and we'll look at them here, there are 8 steps that are suggested as ways to become a more culturally inclusive person. And the first is that we want to begin to discover our own biases. We want to challenge our assumptions, contemplate our emotions. So when you're feeling a reaction, ask ourselves, why am I experiencing this? Really consider our purpose, reflect on our own socialization from a systemic kind of way. So when I talked about the different collectivist versus individualistic values, that's a systemic socialization. That's a set of normative behaviors that are part of a system in which many of us were raised to know and to function. We have to reflect on our own identities, reflect on our own behavior, and then ultimately we must commit to this work. And so I think for the sake of time, I just want to push this question to you. Jot this down as a homework activity to really begin to reflect on where are you in your journey to becoming a more culturally inclusive person. And so I've got some strategies for you in the first handout. So these are on page 24 and 25 of the book, or in the handout on page 9. And so again, my homework assignment for you is that you really dig into some of the strategies that are in this book. But the first thing that we have to do is really make sure that we're doing self-work, that we're working on ourselves, and that we're really beginning to understand other cultures. So what are we reading? What are we learning? How are we examining and checking our own privilege? How are we learning and beginning to shift our own implicit biases? One of the most useful things for me in that journey is understanding your brain and actually understanding how is our brain holding and the prejudices and biases. And when we understand the way it sort of functions in our brain, then we can develop self-regulation strategies to begin to mitigate ways that those manifest in our interactions. Another tool here is grade anonymously. You might think that you don't have bias, but you do. We all do. And so it can affect how we grade our students. And so figure out any way that you can so that you can grade in a way that doesn't reveal who the students are. The next is to make sure that we're always reflecting before we react. Try to practice pausing before you issue some kind of punishment, or whether you're considering, putting academic placement and support services, or how harshly we're grading work. Whatever it is, like, reflect before you react and say, is this reaction a function of what's really necessary, or are my own implicit biases, prejudices, and stereotype reflecting how I want to react? Conduct a critical self-analysis so that you're really looking to understand, what's happening in your classroom. Do an environmental scan of the way in which you teach. Have a trusted peer come in and do an observation. And then finally, there's a recommended way to cold call students. But what this means isn't just like cold call, but it's sort of like let them know that you're going to engage them and then sort of come back to them rather than like this straight cold call. So again, these are some of the strategies for that first way of which we want to get to know our students, know ourselves. So the second thing is the way in which we need to know our students. So culturally responsive educators try to see the learning environment through the eyes of their students, including those who are different cultures. So what this means is that we have to, as educators, really understand who our students are and leverage their knowledge in our curriculum and teaching strategies. We need to be aware of stereotype threat and keep in mind intersectionality. So I'll tell you what those definitions are here in just a second. Certainly what we know about our students is incomplete. I like to use the visualization of an iceberg, and understanding this is that we only see a small portion of our students, and we can make a lot of assumptions about different things, but we could be very wrong. And so in what ways are you in your classroom and your engagement with students really seeking to understand them and get to know them in different kinds of ways? The second piece of getting to know our students is recognizing stereotype threat. So stereotype threat refers to the risk of confirming a self-characteristic, a negative stereotype about one's group. So there are sort of two key requirements that have to happen for stereotype to be in place. One, there has to be a stereotype against your identity in a space, and you have to want to be successful in that space. So an example would be there's a deeply rooted cultural stereotype that women aren't good at math and that women don't become engineers. That's a deeply rooted cultural stereotype. Now, if I want to become an engineer, stereotype threat can affect my performance. And so there's tons of literature that helps us really understand what's happening, but we have to be aware that stereotype threat is at play in our students' lived experiences and begin to challenge the ways that they can affect our students. And so there are some strategies definitely outside the scope of what we're going to do here, but of understanding how do you mitigate the way stereotype threat happens. Now, intersectionality, the definition of this, it's looking at the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to an individual. And what this means is that we're looking at overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or advantage. So if you come from, if your lived experience is that you have multiple intersecting identities, those overlapping systems affect how you move through life, and you can't separate those, right? So just if I'm a woman and then my best friend is a Black woman, our lived experiences aren't the same because she is a Black woman and she's got another layer of system of discrimination that affects her. So you can't intersect, you can't pull apart those identities, that our experiences are going to be different. So even though we share one intersection of identity. And so we have to be aware that these intersections of identity are affecting our students. Now let's look at some strategies for how we can get to better know our students. So this is in the handout, page 9 to 10, or in the book, page 30 to 31. And so the first thing is, and the most important on this list, is to know your students' names. Come up with whatever strategy that you need to get to know your students' names, have them wear name tags, big and bold, that you can see, have them set up table tents in front of them in the classroom. And this virtual setting it's great because they're logging in and you see their names. And so if you haven't learned their names yet, like, this is a great opportunity to do it when they're logged into Zoom platforms like this and everyone's showing their, hopefully showing their camera. Invite students to talk and share about their experiences with you. So this is like a personal kind of connection. You can give students interest surveys, ask them like, how do they feel in your classroom? And then you can certainly look up some different examples of culture and climate surveys as well. Share your story and invite students to share theirs. We want to learn about different cultures and try to meet your students' families as much as that is appropriate. And then make sure that we're catching and learning from cultural mismatches and mistakes. Another quote by Chimamanda Adichie, she's the one from the TED Talk I mentioned earlier. She's one of my favorite, people in this space. And this is actually from her novel, Americana. But one of the lines in the novel, she says, if you don't understand, ask questions. If you're uncomfortable about asking questions, say you're uncomfortable and about asking questions and ask anyway. It's easy to tell when a question is coming from a good place. Then listen some more. Sometimes people just want to feel heard. Here's the possibilities of friendship and connection and understanding. The most important thing here is, I think, listen some more, and really listening with that intent to hear and understand the individuals. And so when you feel like you might be sort of fumbling through this with students, being really honest and transparent and say, I'm trying, I'm working on this, I'm learning, thank you for your patience. I think that can really go a long way in helping people to build that trust and to build that connection with students. So the next piece of our triad is looking at what's happening in the classroom. And so the first thing that we want to look at is the way in which our curriculum is really serving students. And so once you get the book, you can read more about the humanizing pedagogy. But what this is really looking to do is it's looking to connect students' culture into the classroom in a way that is repeated back to them and how they are learning and engaging with what you're bringing to them and teaching. So it's bridging their lived experiences with their sort of school and instructional home. And also it's explicitly teaching hidden institutional codes and customs. So let's look a little bit about what is hidden curriculum. So hidden curriculum informs students about what is valued and not valued by the teacher or institution. So it's these contextual micro messages. So when we looked at the differences between the individualistic and the collectivist values, so my background's in science and engineering and math, right? So if every example that I ever had of engineering, which by the way is still very true for most of what we're teaching students, is about competitions that involve Legos of some sort, right? Then that can become a hidden value that says engineering is for people who are competitive and have access to Legos, right? And so we have to be really thoughtful to like what's not being said or done, what's not being represented in our schools, because that's sending a really big signal of what's valued by us as an educator or by our institution. And so again, it's not just the curriculum, it's looking at codes of conduct, it's looking at dress codes and other institutional policies. So this is something that we've seen in the news a lot, just around Black people's hair, right? Like the fact that we're having to pass laws to say that natural hair is okay is it's remarkable to me that it's not okay, right? But that's been part of our dress codes to say that people that they aren't welcome to have their own hair in this space, right? Like that sense of value that says who you are is not welcome here. And so now we're having to have these sort of mandated and updated laws to really send powerful signals to say that these students are welcome to bring their whole selves to this space, and it doesn't matter what their hair looks like. It doesn't have to subscribe to Western values of hair. And so again, this hidden curriculum is something that we have to take a journey to really dig in and look at and reflect on what's happening for our students. How are they perceiving what is going on in our school by what's not said or done? Now, if you go back to your packet, look on the handout from pages 10 to 14, there are a ton of strategies. And so I can't list all of them here because there are just so many of them, but there are different strategies specifically for ways that you can bring student culture into the classroom. So there's a couple of dozen strategies specifically around that. There are also some strategies for ways that you can bring institutional and socio-political knowledge to the student. And then there's another set of strategies that are specifically for administrators. And I will argue this not even just for administrators, like there are ways for all of us to be leaders in our own right. And so certainly take the time to look over those no matter your job position. And so again, as homework, make sure that you're looking through all of these strategies for ways that you can incorporate them into your work. The last topic I want to introduce to you is on understanding the 5 stages of multiculturalism. So this is in your packet, a little bit of description and an exercise. We won't have time to do the full exercise together, but I want you to be able to reflect on it afterwards. I have to say, the 5 stages were developed by James Bank, and in his original publication, the numbers are differently. But when I designed this, a rocket counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 made more sense. So I have to acknowledge that really they're the other way around, but we're going to talk about them in this order. So the sort of top of this rocket is the curriculum of the mainstream. Like this is just the traditional Western European, often male-dominated curriculum that's mostly represented by many traditional textbooks. It does not include indigenous voices or non-dominant cultures. So this is just sort of status quo, like general curriculum. The next stage of multiculturalism is heroes and holidays. So this is what we call an ethnic additive approach. So it's a way in which educators supplement the traditional curriculum with special events that highlight accomplishments of minorities at certain times of the year. These events are not threatening to the majority culture, right? Because it's so additive. So what I shared with you about my little brother, that's an example of additive. It was a way of trying to add something in for this one day. The next stage is content integration. So at this stage, teachers are adding substantial materials and knowledge about non-dominant groups to the traditional curriculum. And also it means that you're adding substantial non-dominant authors to the curriculum. The next stage is the stage of structural reform. This is where indigenous and non-dominant materials and points of views are interwoven with the existing knowledges to allow students to experience curriculum through various cultural lenses. And this stage, teachers are continuously researching and sourcing materials that represent different perspectives and diverse cultures. And it really decenters the curriculum of the mainstream. And then finally, the sort of pinnacle of the foundation that we're looking for here is multicultural social action and awareness. So this includes all of the things from the structural reform stage, including like important social issues, including racism and sexism and economic injustice. These are all explicitly addressed within our curriculum. And so this means that the voices, the ideas, and the perspectives of students regarding these and all other topics are moved to the center of the learning experience, and the students become a key resource in curriculum development. And so you can see here as we move along these 5 stages of multiculturalism, the difference in how students' voices and perspectives and lived experiences are being integrated into the curriculum. Now, this is certainly an evolution, right? Like, it would be awesome if we could just jump to like true multicultural social action and awareness, but we may not be there yet. And so I certainly encourage you to take as many leaps as you can, but acknowledge that this is a process of adding in these kinds of things, and certainly developing the influence to help others. So I'm getting a message that you've lost audio. Okay, hopefully you can hear me still. Okay, great. All right, so
Audio
again,
is
you've
still
got a
good here.
handout. Okay, great. So you've got a handout that will allow you to reflect more deeply on this. And I believe that the handout also has some examples to help you better understand this. Again, I encourage you to make sure that you get the full book because it goes into greater detail on this. But within the handout, you've got some reflection questions for each of those different stages, as well as examples of what that might look like in your classroom. So the last thing I want us to do is to make a little bit of a plan. And so let's do some reflection around what we've learned today. So first is, I like to do a 3-2-1. So 3 things that you've learned. Oh, I just noticed my instructions are for in person. Pardon that. So 3 things that you've learned today, 2 things that you'll do differently, and then 1 immediate action item. And certainly I hope that you include in this list that you're going to look over the materials and look at all the strategies. So you've got dozens of strategies that you can apply, and then I've given you lots of opportunities for where you can dive in deeper and do a little bit more reflection. So as I'm going to give you just a minute, and I'd love to see some of your notes in the chat box on like what you'll do differently and your action items. And so we had a question from Betsy about how can we get this book. So Amy sent you a link there. We've got Bonnie added the individualistic, collectivist, and culture responsive teaching values. Those are things that you think you've learned. So thanks, Bonnie, adding in also that you're going to do more discussion and personal stories with students. Great. So as we're winding down here, I still would love to see some more of your reflections in a chat box. Great, you're going to take this back to your faculty. Yeah, so as a note, once you get the book, so the book has lesson plans in the back, so you can take some of these exercises and do them with your colleagues. Also in the back of the book is a my cover is falling off. I've used this so much. There's a peer observation checklist, so there's a tool to help you conduct that. And again, so if you're wanting to take this back and help others understand it, you can take advantage of the lesson plan in the back of the book for a variety of the lessons. And so, picking this up will be a very useful tool for you. Great. It looks like some people learned about student assets and can't wait to look at the materials. Yeah, so again, this book is designed for you to read cover to cover. It's not just a workbook. And so when you get it, I hope that you do read it and do the exercises that we skimmed over, and so many of them we skipped, because this is a 90-page document, practically an 85-page document book that you can learn from. So is this book this is not the book that we used for the face-to-face a couple of months ago. Anyways, so if you're still asking about the book, we'll make sure that you've got the resource link to get that. And okay, so I want to offer you now that we welcome your feedback, so you can do a survey at bit.ly/NAEP survey. It is case sensitive, so be thoughtful of that and how you type it in. I'm so grateful that you chose to be here with us today. I'm going to curate a few resources that I'm going to send to Amy, and then she can distribute to all of you as well. And so you've got the handout, so you've got at least the strategies that you can refer on to from here on out. But I'll send some other links of things that might be useful to you in your learning. I want to acknowledge that your job is hard every day, and now I imagine it's 10 times harder. And so I understand that life is complicated and that you're juggling so much. And I just want you to know that I see you. Well, I don't see you, but in my mind, I see you. And those of us who support educators are just standing here, rooting for you and really wishing you the most success as you're shifting everything. And I'm grateful for what you are doing to serve our students. And I want you to keep in mind that even though everything is shifted to an online sort of platform, there's still so much that we can do and must do to make sure that we're reaching every student. Accessibility really becomes a big issue in these kinds of spaces. It becomes much easier for students to fall by the wayside and to get behind and to not feel like they are part of things. It's so easy in online learning spaces for us to just sort of do what's always been done, and we'll align too heavily on so often those individualistic values. And so I want you to continue to reflect and see, how can I honor different ways of knowing and doing, and make sure that we're still keeping a deeply relational component to your courses and classroom. So I am 2 minutes over, and I want to thank you so much for your time. And you can contact me if you need anything, and I will make sure that you have my information as well. All right, thank you all so much. I'm happy to stay online if you have questions and answer them. You can put them in the box and I'll answer them out loud. But for the sake of time, I'm going to close this portion.
Well, I'll do some little wrapping up. So yeah, thank you so much, Megan. This was fantastic. I love the response by everybody, so I think it's been a great webinar. Just to let everybody know, I will be sharing the recording of the webinar. I will be sharing the handouts, and whatever other links Megan shares with me, I will share with you on Monday, Tuesday at the latest, depending on how YouTube gets everything loaded. And again, if you have questions, I'll also, Megan, if it's okay, I'll share Megan's email and you can direct questions to Megan. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. And again, if you're a part of the cohort that's been meeting in the northern part of the state, fantastic. If you're part of the southern cohort that's working on forming for next fall, that's fantastic as well. And again, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for your patience. And please stay safe. Please wash your hands. Please stay home. It is a very crazy and strange time that we're in, but we will get through this and we'll get back to our normal world. So with that, thank you all very much. And everyone, have a wonderful weekend. Get out, walk, enjoy,
yes,
and be healthy, please.
Yes. And like I said, I'll stay on a few more minutes. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amy, we've got a question about, do they receive a certificate?
Yeah, we've had that question a couple times. They can receive a certificate of attendance, but we do not have CEUs or CPTUs at this time.
Okay. Okay. Wondering, Amy, for the webinar in a couple of weeks, to figure out like why nothing is in the chat box.
Yeah, I was troubleshooting that while we were on, so I'll figure that out. I think a lot of it has to do with how they're opening. If it's open on a
Yes.
phone, it's different than, and all of these platforms. I'm trying to stop our recording here, which I'm not.
So Aaron, I just want to acknowledge I see your post, and as an academic advisor, and so there's so much of this is deeply tied to, it's just tied to relationships really. And so I want to make sure that you know, if you can get the book, read the handout. But when we think about this three components, right, so the three components are like knowing ourselves, knowing our students, and the third component was knowing the classroom. But in your case, it's knowing your office space and knowing the sort of climate around how you advise students. It could be, you know, it's just an examination of all of those things and really developing those strategies to understand how can I make sure that I'm knowing my students, how can I make sure that I'm doing my own work to really challenge my own biases and to see the ways in which who you are is affecting your work. And so I do think that hopefully, if you're still listening, that you'll see the way in which what we've provided can really help you as well. Okay, great, Aaron. I'm glad you heard that. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. But I do think that this is, like I said, really about relationship.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan. Yeah, I will look into the issue with the chat versus the question, because I'm not sure. We had a webinar just yesterday and it didn't have an issue, and then today we did. So I know all of these platforms are doing updates regularly to meet the need of all of us moving to the virtual realm, and
Yeah.
we'll just have to see. But thank you so much, and thank you, Tyler and Kathleen, and I'm going to log us off now.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Have a great weekend. Thank you.